Welcome to Yesterday, Today, Tomorrow. My name is Mariana Portier, and I am your host. This week, we are discussing the impact of the lack of print media, what it has had on the country and the public, and also the importance of reliable media. My guests today are Bob Levy, a prize-winning journalist, Rafael Lorente, an associate dean with the Philip Merrill College of Journalism, and retired Colonel Manuel Superville from the U.S. Army. So, gentlemen, I'm so happy to have you here to talk about the fact that print media is really having an impact that we don't have it. And Bob, what is that impact that you see on the public?
There are two kinds of Mariana. One is a journalism impact and one is a business impact. And unfortunately, they both have cratered at the same time. What we're seeing is the inability of local media, particularly local newspapers, to compete in the wider marketplace. In the last 17 years in the United States, 1,800 local newspapers have failed. That is not a trickle, that is a flood. That is a disaster. And it's not just a disaster, I say, having spent or misspent my life in print media. It is a disaster because, and we say this a bit self-servingly maybe, we filled a role and still do in those rare instances where print media still exist on the local level that no one else has fulfilled. And then you consider that in the last 27 years, the internet has absolutely obliterated any sense of patience within any of the media. The good news about print media is that it takes a while to produce these. The stories are edited, they're edited again, they're done very carefully. And on the other hand, we now have the internet, which is attracting more and more clicks, more and more people. And what I like to say about that is that the internet reminds me of a raging river after a rainstorm. All kinds of stuff is floating down there. You see trees, you see cars, you see washing machines, you see mud, and every once in a while, you do see pure water. But you got to work very hard to find it on the internet. And the good news about the print media was always that you didn't have to look hard. It was right there.
And that's something that I think the public really misses. I mean, I see it in my local jurisdiction, notices of what the county government was doing, things about projects. It's just tough because in the internet, it's not that easily accessible. And why is that, Professor Lorente?
Well, as Bob said, the not only have 1,800 newspapers disappeared, we're talking about a circulation decline of 45%. This is people getting newspapers around the country. That's a huge percentage over the last 10 or 11 years, and I'm fudging the numbers a little bit. The speed, as Bob mentioned, is terrible, and is terrible for quality. But in terms of getting, as you said, getting the information, it's completely been disaggregated. When you got your newspaper, everything was in a section and you could go find your local news, you could find your sports, you could find your classifieds, whatever it was you were looking for. All those pieces have been torn apart on the internet. So now you have to look for your county zoning notice, you have to look for the projects, you have to look for the high school sports. They're all in different places. So the audience is fragmented. If I bought the newspaper 15 years ago because I really only wanted to read sports, I still saw the front page. I don't have to see the front page now. I can just get sports. Or if you really want to take that to where it's really affecting democracy, I can just look at the perspectives that I want to look at. I can read news from this perspective or that perspective and ignore others. And that means that when Bob and I arrive at the water cooler, we have completely different views of the world. We literally have a different version of history in our heads.
And that's what's concerning, is the different versions of history. I'm like flabbergasted sometimes with, the take on any one news story that is so completely apart. Is there any comeback from this?
Well, Mariana, I think to understand that, you have to understand not just the disaggregation that Professor Laurenti was talking about, but the absolute fudging of the borders between hard news and opinion. The internet has given us this. Bless you, internet. I'm so glad you've done this. That's a joke. It has made it so much harder for serious journalists to be serious and to keep that bright red line between opinion and straight journalism.
And that's a problem, because how can you tell what's opinion and what's fact?
Well, in a newspaper, it's easy to tell because the opinion pieces and pages are labeled, and everything else is news. It's all right there every single day, and on the internet, sometimes it is very hard to tell.
You asked if there was any comeback from this, and I am actually optimistic that there is a comeback from this. It's not print news. We're not going to print the Miami Herald that I worked at 25 years ago, or however long ago, I don't even remember, is never coming back to what it was. But I think people have begun to realize, and institutions have begun to realize around the country, that the loss of news, particularly at the local level, is hurting democracy. There's research that shows that people who engage with local news are more likely to vote in local elections, for example. So they literally participate more because they're more engaged. Now, which, chicken or the egg, I'm not the expert there. But there are all kinds of projects around the country, nonprofit news organizations that are popping up, donors who are seeing this is an important place to put money. I can tell you that as the sort of big journalism program around here, we get somebody come to us every week saying, can you help us with XYZ local project? Now, we don't have the money or the bandwidth to do that, but what this tells me is that people are trying, and there are some interesting projects out there that are starting to bear out.
Before we go down that road, I wanted to bring in Colonel Zuberville. Your experience in the military and seeing how democracy evolves in different jurisdictions and countries, and now with what we've got going on in the Ukraine, how important do you find news and reliable media for those operations?
Thank you, Mariana. First, I wanted to comment that I agree with what both Rafael and Bob have said so far. I would also add that, not just print media, but even when I was a child, you could watch you could watch CBS News, for example, with Walter Cronkite. And then on Friday evenings, the last 5 minutes of the show, he would say, and now for this week's op-ed or for this week's editorial, here's Eric Sevareid. So to Bob's point, even that clear demarcation between news and opinion, even on TV back in the 60s, that's how it was. I would also point out, though, that while I'm not the expert on journalism that both of these two guests are, but let's not forget that it was in the 19th century, print media was extremely biased, got us into a lot of problems that we didn't necessarily need to get into. I think the label for it was yellow journalism. And so what I want to ask, I'll respond to your other question, Mariana, but I would like for both Bob and Rafael to address the historical context of print media, because to me, it seems like that we have lived in a golden age, if you will, from probably the 40s on to maybe till the advent of the internet, let's say. And then finally, to the question about democracy, yeah, look, I mean, you can only make rational decisions for national security or local politics or anything else if you have facts, and you have to distinguish between facts and assumptions and just lies. And that is what is those three. That's all three of those are flowing through that washed riverbed that Bob was talking about. And how do you pick out? And there's nothing wrong with assumptions. I mean, you have to have assumptions. In fact, in military planning, you have a fact section and an assumption section. but you don't have a lie section. Because if you had a lie section and you base decisions off of lies, people are going to get killed. And so it is terribly important to be able to distinguish between those three things. And yes, today, whether it's Twitter, it's not just the internet, it's Twitter and Facebook and everything else. It all gets jumbled together, and it's very difficult to tell them apart.
Let me jump in and respond to the Colonel here. Colonel, thank you for raising the question of yellow journalism, because I think it points to today and to tomorrow for us. The reason yellow journalism died and so-called objective journalism arrived about 120 years ago was that consumer tastes changed. And the reason that consumer tastes changed was that more and more people suddenly were educated in the United States. They knew they needed a certain trustworthy journalism. They sought it, they paid for it, they supported it, and it flourished for 100 years. And one of the reasons that I am somewhat optimistic about the future here is exactly the same reason. We now have more college graduates in our country than we've ever had before. We have a higher percentage of educated people than we've ever had before. We have people who understand that good things cost money, because they understand that in every other area of their lives. There might be another golden era coming along because of education, which drives consumer tastes.
And what I would say, the Colonel is absolutely right. And I would say it's not simply yellow journalism. I was a reporter until about 2005. I covered everything from very local stories to national and international stories. More often in the US context, I was the only Spanish-speaking reporter in the room. Diversity was a problem. And if you go just a little further back in time, as late as the 1940s and 50s, and even into the early 1960s, and our students just finished a huge project on this called Printing Hate. American newspapers not only covered racial violence and lynchings, but in many parts of the country encouraged them and helped create the conditions that got many Americans killed, particularly in the South. So there was a lot wrong with the old world, and there's actually a tremendous amount of good journalism today, probably more than ever. The problem, as Bob said, is you got to sort it as it goes by you down that river.
Yeah, Marianne, if I could comment also, is that the complexity, life is really complex, and life has gotten more complex with time. The absence of print journalism, investigative reporting, not like Rafael said, not that the talent isn't there to do it. It's to be able to put it out there to where people can see it, educated people can see it. Like Bob said, more people are educated. My point is that the lives are so complex and everything is on such a fast pace that people want a quick and immediate answer to everything that can be put in a tweet or something else, when that's just not how the world works. Issues are super complex. This whole thing in the war in Ukraine and the invasion by Putin, that doesn't lend itself to a few sound bites. It doesn't lend itself to repetitive cable news storytelling to see how many viewers you can get. It is an extraordinarily complex issue, and only multiple pages in a newspaper or a magazine can actually do it justice to try and provide people with the basic understanding, so then they can make decisions that impact the political process.
Bob, do you want to comment on that?
I do. All of that I agree with, Colonel, except you have not touched on the business question. You have not touched on the ability and the willingness of people to vote with their pocketbooks. And what I see out there is a tremendous amount of impatience, but also a real gravitation toward the newest, shiniest thing. If somebody says they have to have some super duper new cell phone, everybody's going to stand in line outside of Apple for 3 hours to get it. Everybody says that they got to get the latest thing and the quickest thing on Twitter, and they've got to pay a premium to get it. They will do it. there is something stodgy in the minds of younger Americans about print journalism, even though, as all of us have been saying, it really does deliver the goods. So I see this indivisibly as a business problem, just as much as it is a journalism problem.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that, Bob, but it goes back to your hope that we have more educated people today than ever before. I guess, and maybe this isn't necessarily the forum for it, the discussion, but the follow-on question would be, how do you define education? How do you find educated people? Because just because they have a college degree, you know, if you want to use that as the metric, then sure, we have more college educated people. But today's, I would argue that a degree today in terms of what it addresses and how it educates as compared to 20, 30, 40 years ago might be very different. And I think that hyper consumerism that you were discussing is a reflection of some of the flaws in our educational system today.
The business model is a problem, and the business model is not coming back. That the old business model is done. And as a person, you know, as a guy who loves his newspaper, worked for newspapers, still gets the newspaper at his door, it was kind of our fault. We let our business go away. For many decades, newspapers in particular did not innovate, watched technology come and said, oh, this won't affect us because we have a monopoly on X, Y, and Z. Well, people came along and took the monopolies, and the classifieds left and the auto ads left. And before you knew it, you weren't making enough money. And the answer by most newspaper companies was to keep their profits up by cutting staff. So essentially they cut their product in order to keep making money. Well, we all know how that works eventually, and that didn't go so well. Where I see optimism is in all kinds of folks all over the country trying new and different business models. The small nonprofits around the country are producing terrific local journalism, some of the best investigative work. The big nonprofits, the ProPublicas and the Texas Tribunes, are doing incredible work, the Marshall Project. And then the big newspapers are still doing well. I'm not worried about the New York Times anytime soon. They're doing just fine. The question, I think, for the rest of the country, for the people who don't live out inside the Beltway or don't live in places where they have these newspapers, is what do we do at the local level? Mm-hmm. It is hard for me to tell one of my students, you should take a job at a local newspaper. They don't get paid enough. They don't make a living wage to live in almost any place. And there's no security in that low-paying job on top of that. We have to find a business model that works for local news and allows the people who produce it. Because being a reporter is fun, but it's a lot of work. And the salaries are worse than they were 30 years ago, and they were terrible 30 years ago.
Well, let me ask you, because I know that there are jurisdictions that have decided to fund local papers or have local papers. I think City of College Park has a paper, and but there are some inherent dangers with that, aren't there, Raphael?
Yeah, look, I think it's well-intentioned. Where I live just south of the University of Maryland campus, the city of Hyattsville to my south, the city of College Park to the north, both have funded local newspapers, and I appreciate the intention. At the same time, I don't really want my government funding a newspaper, at least not that directly. But there are some creative tax incentives and proposals around the country that people have started to make that could indirectly help that process a little bit.
What about, go ahead, Manny.
Yeah, I was going to ask Raphael, why, what's the risk or the downside to local government contributing, sponsoring, or otherwise paying for a local newspaper? What you said you didn't think that was a good idea, but I'm curious to get your opinion.
That in the end, my job as a journalist is to ask people in power really uncomfortable questions, and on occasion ruin their careers. And the people who pay for the news aren't going to want me to do that when I start looking at their books, right? When it works best, there's a respectful relationship, but even in a respectful relationship, if I'm writing stories that the people who are funding me don't like, they're going to stop funding.
There's in other places, and here in the United States, we don't have much of that, of course, but on the television side with PBS or National Public Radio are both perhaps if you and Bob could address those models in the US, and then in the UK and in France, they have publicly funded media. And so I understand your point, Raphael, about that potential chilling effect, but I just don't know enough about it. It would be interesting to hear your opinion about how that could be.
Well, National Public Radio and PBS are funded only partially by the government. You will see anytime you listen or watch them that they have a list of sponsors that would be the envy of any newspaper publisher around. What's really going on there is just what Raphael said a minute ago. They are willing to acknowledge that they accept government money, but they get along with that in the bargain a tremendous amount of controversy, a tremendous amount of political backwash every time their money comes up for renewal. In some ways, it's just not worth it. It's not worth it to be seen as an instrument of one party or another. If you can build a business model that's completely based on non-aligned money, private money, I think you're going to do better.
Yeah, and to add to that, that's not to say that there aren't issues with private money, right? That the joke at large metropolitan newspapers always was nobody ever does stories about the car dealerships. Well, there was a good reason for that because they funded a lot of newspapers, right? So there are some models where the funding is indirect, right? It's a tax on this that goes in some direction or whatever. There have been several proposed models. Whether one of them would work in this country, I think our history says it would be really hard to sell. And like Bob says, PBS and NPR get all this flack. And when we talk about, I'll just put in a plug for PBS. When you watch the NewsHour and you watch anybody else's newscast, nobody's even playing in their field, and they're doing it with less money than anybody else.
That's amazing. And so should this then become something where regulation would come in to say that you got to differentiate opinion from fact, or something so the consumer knows what is it that they're reading? Bob?
Well, in print, that goes on routinely, Mariana. There's never been any doubt about that. But I would say this, that if we're going to have media that have the independence that we all want, the independence that we all depend on, the model that really attracts me more and more is the philanthropic model. We are the most generous country in history. We're the most generous in the world by a long, long way. We give money to a zillion different causes. And if the case could be made, as we did about 20 minutes ago, that this is important, not just for publishers and journalists, but for the public, I think philanthropic dollars could really be there. And indeed, that is happening in a bunch of markets. A lot of it is fledgling at the moment. I wish them the best. It isn't going to be simple, but I do think that that's a better way to go than government.
How do you distinguish between what Bob, how do you distinguish between what Raphael said at the local level, not doing investigations on car dealerships, which was, philanthropic, it wasn't political, it wasn't political, it was about something else going on. But right now there are a lot of very wealthy people who are donating or making philanthropic gifts, but they have a very particular, let's say, political ideology that they expect whoever they're giving the money to follow.
Yeah, absolutely true. And you just have to sniff those out. You'd have to judge them one at a time. What you want is large numbers of dollars from non-aligned people, if you can find them.
And what matters is a diversity of funding. So one of the things that most of the best of these nonprofits is doing is they're also getting revenue from subscriptions, right? So the old newspaper model was the revenue came really from the advertising. What we paid for the subscription didn't pay anything really. Now the subscription revenue at many organizations is much higher than the revenue from advertising. If you can combine subscription revenue, philanthropic money, and other business models, again, look at what Texas Tribune does with events and other things, what ProPublica and others have done. There are other ways to make money. The news industry just needs to be innovative and not sit around and wait for it to show up, which is the way we behaved for way too long.
Rafael, I'll give you the last 30 seconds. What would you like the audience to know about missing print media?
I would tell the audience what I tell the parents of prospective students who visit us. They come and they're nervous because they really wanted their kids to be engineers and their kids want to be journalists. And they ask me as they're walking down the hall, will there be journalism? Will there be jobs? And my answer is always, that's not the worry. The worry is, will there be democracy? And if you want democracy, you need journalism. So figure it out.
That is really well said. And you know, the transparency and all of that that comes with, you know, the exposure that the media gives to different stories and even those dealerships, I believe is super important. But we are out of time. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for doing this show. It was fantastic. To the audience, thank you for watching. We are going to be on Yesterday, Today, Tomorrow show on YouTube and on Facebook. Thank you so much. Until next time.